Okay, hi everyone. My name is Remy Hoff, and the title of my study is Hindsight Bias and the COVID-19 Outbreak. So, what is hindsight bias? Hindsight bias is the tendency for humans to believe that they could have predicted an event all along, when in fact, this is usually untrue. So, the sense that they knew it all along. So here's an example. If one was asked, how many times do you think humans blink in one day? They might say something like 100,000 times per day. And then upon learning that the correct answer is actually somewhere around 30,000 times per day, they might tailor their hindsight estimate to be closer to the actual correct answer. So somewhere around 50,000 times per day instead of 100,000 times per day. So what do we already know about hindsight bias? We know that it occurs after a period of time, so the time between collecting the participants' first estimate and collecting their hindsight estimate. Hell et al. Found in 1988 that the longer the time between the first and hindsight estimate, the more likely it is that the participant will show hindsight bias. So for example, you might wait 1 hour between the two collections, or you might wait 1 day, and it would be more likely that you would see hindsight bias in a participant who waited a day between data collections than one who waited an hour. We also know that there are two different kinds of guessers, so field-dependent and field-independent guessers. Dependent guessers rely on context clues to come up with their estimates, whereas independent guessers rely on details to come up with theirs. Davies found in 1992 that field-dependent guessers, so guessers who rely on contextual clues, actually were much more likely to show hindsight bias than were independent guessers, so independent guessers that rely on details instead of contextual clues. We also know from two different studies conducted by Bernstein et al. In 2007 and 2011 that hindsight bias is developed between the ages of 3 and 5, and that hindsight bias actually exists throughout the lifespan of humans. They actually found that young children and elderly adults were the most likely to display hindsight bias, but that young adults and older adults also show hindsight bias, so it's important to know that the problem persists throughout the lifespan. So for my research question, I realized that we are in a unique situation, the COVID-19 outbreak. There's a lot of blaming going on between political parties as well as between countries, and a lot of finger pointing and uncertainty, but in particular, I noticed a lot of people are claiming that they could have foreseen these events unfolding, and that we should have been able to stop this before it got as far as it did. This made me wonder if hindsight bias is playing a role in all of the blaming going on during this time. So my research question became, is hindsight bias playing a role in the COVID-19 crisis? If so, that would definitely provide an explanation for the finger pointing that we're seeing as a society. So I used the previous research discussed to make sure I accounted for confounding variables that would be a problem in my study if they existed. I tried to keep the time between collecting the first and hindsight estimates the same between participants, and I also made sure not to display any contextual clues in my study so that dependent guessers did not have a disadvantage. I also kept in mind that my sample consisted of young adults, which, like all ages, have been shown to exhibit hindsight bias in the past. So I had 7 participants, male and female, all of which are CSU undergraduate students enrolled in a cognitive psychology lab. My study was within subjects, and because of limitations due to COVID-19, my materials consisted of computers, mine and participants, as well as email correspondence. So first I sent out a study consisting of 11 questions, 10 of which centered around the history of COVID-19 and how it spreads. The last question asked the participants to guess how many confirmed COVID-19 cases the US would report as of April 21st, 2020, so 7 days from the time that I sent out the survey. On April 21st, so 7 days later, I provided the correct answer to my participants and asked them to estimate what their original guess had been. Once I'd collected all my data, I split the participants into groups based on their level of knowledge on COVID-19. So based off of the survey that they completed, I divided them into high and low knowledge participants. So if they scored 5 or higher on the survey, they were considered high knowledge, and if they scored 4 or lower, they were considered low knowledge. So that's excluding the 11th question. So here are my results. As you can see, there are a couple of interesting things going on here. The correct answer was 776,023 confirmed US COVID-19 cases as of April 21st, 2020. Participants who showed high knowledge on COVID-19 tended to guess on average lower and closer to the correct answer than did low knowledge participants. You can also see that low knowledge participants did not alter their hindsight estimates. They were actually exactly the same as their initial estimates. However, I didn't find any significant effects in my study. The estimated type effect, initial versus hindsight, was not significant, nor was the level of knowledge significant in its effect. The interaction between the two was also not significant. So my findings were inconsistent with my hypothesis, suggesting that hindsight bias is not being displayed in my participants during this crisis. However, some limitations that I had were a very small sample size. Only 7 people participated, and I was also not able to effectively communicate with my participants since it had to be over email. Also, because of that, I had a wide variety in response times between my participants, so I was not able to keep the time block completely consistent between participants, and all of these limitations certainly could have influenced my results. So for future directions, since I had significant limitations due to COVID-19, I definitely want to redo this study with more participants and in person. Ideally, I would want more like 100 participants, definitely more than 7. I would also like to conduct this same study on older adults and compare my results with my study on younger adults to see which age group exhibits more hindsight bias. So here are my references. And I just want to say thank you for your participation. If you participate in my study, definitely thank you so much. And if you're watching this presentation, thank you again. And I hope you all have a great day.